You've walked past that goose before, the one standing at the edge of the pond while the rest of the flock feeds at the far end, the one that's been at the same spot 3 mornings in a row. You probably assumed she was resting or old or simply being a goose in the particular way that geese sometimes are. Still, separate, oriented away from the activity, not obviously doing anything. You were walking past a documented grief response. You didn't have the frame for it. Most people don't. Most people assume that mate loss in geese produces a brief behavioral change, a few days of disruption, then reintegration into the flock, the biology of the bird reasserting itself over whatever the bird experienced. In fact, the response to mate loss in Canada geese is physiologically measurable for weeks, behaviorally sequenced in a way that functions as a timeline and close enough in its profile to human bereavement responses that the researchers who first documented it held their findings for 2 years before publishing. What you walked past was an animal running cortisol at predator and counter levels with no predator present. An animal whose heart rate has been elevated for days. An animal following a search pattern driven by an internal model of a bird her body is still expecting to find, returning to the same locations every 2 to 6 hours, including after those locations have been cleared of any sensory evidence of the mate's presence. Welcome back. Subscribe before you leave. What you're about to understand will change every goose you see standing alone. The third section covers what the search actually is. The last one changes everything. Number 1, what happens inside a goose's body in the first 48 hours after its mate dies. Most people assume that whatever a goose experiences when its mate dies is behavioral rather than physiological. A change in what the goose does, observable from the outside, rather than a change in what the goose's body is producing at the biochemical level. In fact, the physiological response precedes the behavioral one. It is running before any behavioral change is visible to an observer, and it is measurable in blood chemistry before the goose has done anything that looks different from a goose having a normal morning. Research from the Conrad Lorenz Institute and longitudinal studies on greylag in Canada. Goose pair bonding, published in Hormones and Behavior, established the physiological timeline with unusual precision. Within 24 to 48 hours of mate loss, cortisol levels in bereaved geese rise to concentrations typically associated with acute physical threat, the equivalent, in measurable terms, of what the same bird's cortisol looks like during an active predator encounter. Baseline heart rate elevates by 15 to 20% above resting levels. Immune marker concentrations shift into a pattern consistent with chronic stress activation. The immune profile of an animal that has been under sustained threat for days, not hours. These changes occur regardless of whether the surviving bird witnessed the partner's death or simply found the partner absent one morning. The physiological response is triggered by the absence of the bond, not by the specific event of loss. The body responds to the missing partner the way it would respond to a sustained, unresolvable threat, because, in physiological terms, that is what it is. A goose at the pond the morning after her mate did not return to the roost, standing at the water's edge looking like a goose standing at a pond. Inside, cortisol running at predator encounter concentration, heart rate elevated, immune markers shifting. She has not yet done anything behaviorally unusual. She is physiologically already deep into a response that will take weeks to resolve, and that she has no mechanism to accelerate. What this tells you about that goose is this: she is not simply behaving differently. She is different at the biochemical level in ways that have nothing to do with choice or habit, and that will persist regardless of what she decides to do next. Not because she decides, but because her body is running a response that was already underway before the morning began. But the physiology is only what's running underneath. What the goose does with her body in those first days is the part that most people who observe it never forget. Number 2, the behavioral sequence that follows mate loss and why it is consistent enough to function as a timeline. Most people who have observed a goose after mate loss describe the behavior as erratic, disrupted movement, apparent confusion, the bird seeming lost in a way that doesn't resolve clearly into any single readable state. The behavior is not erratic. It follows a sequence. Researchers who have tracked individually marked geese through mate loss across multiple populations and multiple years have documented a four-phase behavioral progression so consistent across individuals that it functions, in the field, as a diagnostic timeline, a way of reading from observation alone how many days ago the loss occurred. The research establishing this comes from the University of Exeter's Center for Research in Animal Behavior and from the extended greylag goose studies initiated by Konrad Lorenz and continued by his colleagues across decades of longitudinal observation. The four phases, acute searching, ranging, reduced feeding, and social withdrawal, each occupy a predictable window following mate loss, and each has a characteristic behavioral signature. Acute searching begins within hours of the mate's absence and involves repeated returns to locations the pair use together, the nest site, preferred foraging areas, regular roost locations. It is active, directional movement, not aimless wandering, and it lasts 2 to 4 days before the pattern shifts. Ranging begins as acute searching narrows. The bereaved bird moves into areas outside the established pair territory, areas the pair did not use together in a pattern researchers interpret as a secondary search of novel locations after the familiar ones have been exhausted. Ranging lasts 4 to 8 days. Reduced feeding overlaps with both. Active foraging time drops by 30 to 40% and persists for 2 to 3 weeks, independent of food availability, representing a genuine suppression of feeding motivation rather than a response to changed conditions. Social withdrawal, reduced participation in flock activity, reduced responsiveness to flock-level behavioral cues, is the last phase to appear clearly and the last to resolve, persisting in some individuals for the remainder of the season. A goose at the feeding area every morning for 11 years with her mate. Now present but not feeding, standing at the edge of the group, oriented slightly away from the flock, leaving the feeding site mid-morning to return to the nest location at a time when she would previously have still been foraging. A researcher watching her, who has seen this sequence before, knows from the combination of behaviors that the loss occurred between 2 and 5 days ago. What this tells you about grieving geese is this: the behavior is not confusion, and it is not random. It is a sequence running on a biological clock, following a timeline the individual bird did not set and cannot override, in a progression that will complete on its own schedule, regardless of what the bird does or what the environment offers. And then there is the search behavior itself, what it actually looks like up close, and why it continues long after any functional explanation for it has expired. Number 3, the search, and what a goose is doing when she keeps returning to the same spot for days. Most people who watch a goose returning repeatedly to a location associated with her lost mate interpret the behavior as waiting, a passive, hope-adjacent state in which the bird is simply not ready to accept the mate's absence and is remaining near the last known location until something resolves the uncertainty. The behavior is not passive, it is active, spatially structured, and it continues in the same pattern after researchers have removed every physical trace of the mate from every location the goose keeps returning to, which means the goose is not responding to sensory evidence of the mate's presence. She is responding to something internal. Field research from the Wildlife Conservation Society and observational studies published in Animal Cognition tracked individually marked bereaved geese using GPS loggers through the acute search phase. The spatial data from those GPS tracks produced a finding that the researchers describe with careful language in the published paper and with considerably less careful language in interviews. The search is not a search for the mate. It is a search generated by a model of the mate. an internal representation of where the mate should be, producing predictions about locations, driving movement to those locations to test the predictions, and updating slowly when the predictions are repeatedly disconfirmed. The GPS data showed bereaved geese returning to between 3 and 7 specific locations associated with the lost mate, in a rotation at intervals of 2 to 6 hours. When mate remains were removed from a location, return visits to that location did not immediately cease. They continued at the same frequency for 2 to 4 additional days before declining, the internal model updating toward absence more slowly than the physical evidence had changed. The goose is not finding evidence of the mate at the reeds on the north bank. She has not found evidence there for 4 days. She will go back this afternoon. A goose at the north end of the pond for the 4th time in 2 days, 11 minutes, standing, leaving, back by early afternoon. She is not waiting. She is running a prediction, returning to test it, finding it disconfirmed, and returning again when the model generates the prediction again. Because the model has not yet updated fully to the new state of the world, and it will not update on a timeline that has anything to do with the physical evidence available to her. What this tells you about what geese are capable of is this. She has an internal representation of her mate that generates specific predictions about where the mate should be. That representation persists after the mate is gone. It drives behavior. It updates slowly. That is not simple instinct. That is closer to memory with expectations attached. And it is running in a bird standing at the edge of a public pond on a Tuesday morning while people walk past her to get to work. Number 4 changes what you understand about what the bond actually was and why losing it costs the surviving bird more than a change in routine. Number 4, what goose pair bonds actually are and why losing one produces a response that looks less like adjustment and more like a system failure. Most people understand that geese mate for life in the sense of loyalty. The same 2 birds returning to each other across seasons. The partnership stable across years. Most people do not understand what the bond is doing at the physiological level and why its disruption produces a cortisol response equivalent to a predator encounter rather than the milder stress response you would expect from a behavioral disruption or a change in routine. Research from the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology and pair bond physiology studies in long-term monogamous bird species, published in PLOS 1, establish the mechanism. In Canada and greylag geese, the pair bond is not a behavioral arrangement sitting on top of an otherwise independent physiology. It is a co-regulatory system. Each partner's presence actively modulates the other's stress hormone baseline, heart rate variability, and immune function. Bonded geese show measurably lower resting cortisol than their unbonded counterparts. They show more stable heart rate variability, a marker of physiological resilience. Their immune function is measurably stronger. The partner is not a companion in the casual sense. The partner is, in measurable physiological terms, a buffer, a continuous environmental input that holds the surviving bird stress systems at a regulated baseline they cannot maintain alone. When the bond ends, the buffer ends. The surviving bird stress systems revert to an unbuffered state. Cortisol rises not because a threat has appeared, but because the system that was suppressing it is gone. The physiological response that looks from the outside like grief is from the inside, a stress regulation system running without the input it was calibrated to expect. The predator encounter cortisol is accurate. Sure, the absence of the partner is, to the bird's physiology, indistinguishable from a sustained, unresolvable threat. 2 geese at the water's edge at dusk every evening, the physical proximity, the synchronized alertness. One sleeping while the other watches. They look like companionship. They are a single integrated physiological unit, each bird's stress systems calibrated to the other's presence, running together at a baseline neither can sustain alone. Remove one. The other's cortisol spikes to predator encounter levels, not because she is frightened, because half of her regulatory system is gone and her body is responding to that with the only response it has for sustained, unresolvable threat. What this tells you about every goose you have ever seen paired at a pond is this: that partnership is not social preference, it is physiological infrastructure. And the bird standing alone at the water's edge is not lonely in the casual sense. She is dysregulated in the clinical sense, running without a system her body spent years depending on, and showing it in blood chemistry that would be legible to any endocrinologist who read the panel without knowing it came from a goose. I've saved this one for last, because it is the thing that changes what you see when you look at a goose standing alone, and once you see it, you can't go back to not seeing it. Canada geese live for 10 to 24 years. A bonded pair may spend 8 to 15 years together before one dies. In that time, the bond has become so integrated into each bird's physiological baseline that the partner's presence is as metabolically ordinary as breathing, a continuous environmental input that holds the surviving bird's cortisol, heart rate, and immune function at a regulated state she has not experienced independently since before the bond formed. The partner's absence is, in measurable blood chemistry terms, an acute stressor that does not resolve, a predator encounter that keeps not ending, generating cortisol at encounter-level concentrations for weeks, suppressing immune function for the remainder of the season in some individuals, reducing foraging by 30 to 40% across 3 weeks regardless of food availability. Some bereaved geese do not repair for years. Some do not repair at all. The researchers who documented this held their data for 2 years before publishing it. You have walked past that goose, on the way to work, on a morning walk, at a park, where the geese are so familiar they have become background. She was standing at the edge of something: water, path, grass, slightly apart from the flock, not feeding, oriented in a direction that had no obvious object. She looked like a goose standing somewhere. She was running a documented grief response. Her cortisol was at predator encounter concentration. Her heart rate was elevated. She had been returning to 3 to 7 specific locations every 2 to 6 hours for days. Driven by an internal model of a bird her body was still expecting to find, that model updating more slowly than the evidence available to her. You walked past. Most people did. There was no frame for what she was: one goose, water's edge, not following the flock. Her cortisol has been running at predator encounter levels for 6 days. There is no predator. The predator is the absence of the bird she spent 11 years next to. The absence does not resolve. The cortisol stays. Her body does not know the difference between a predator that won't leave and a partner that is simply gone. It responds to both the same way. It will respond this way for weeks. You don't need to do anything with this. You don't need to approach the goose or feel differently about geese as a category or carry this information as a weight. You just need to know that she is not background. She is not ambient nature. She is an animal running a documented physiological and behavioral response that researchers can read like a clock. And she is doing it in public, in plain view, at ponds and parks and golf course lakes and the edges of suburban retention basins, in full sight of people who have been walking past her every morning without knowing what they were walking past. The people who have paused at a goose standing alone at a pond, who felt something unnameable in the stillness of it, who couldn't say why the image stayed with them, but it did, were responding to something real. The goose was broadcasting something, not deliberately, physiologically. The posture, the stillness, the orientation away from the flock, the returns to the same spot at the same intervals, all of it readable if you had the frame. They had the instinct without the frame. Now they have both. Go back to where we started: the pond, the morning, the flock at the far bank, and one goose who has not followed, standing where she stood yesterday and the day before. You know now what that stillness contains: the cortisol, the search pattern, the internal model of a missing bird generating predictions that keep sending her back to the reeds at the north end every 2 hours. She is not resting. She is not confused. She is grieving measurably on a timeline in a way that is now documented and readable and visible to anyone who knows what they are looking at. She will be at the north end of the pond by early afternoon. She will be there again tomorrow. The next time you pass a pond or park with geese, look for the one that isn't moving with the flock. Watch for 30 seconds. Notice whether she is oriented away from the group, whether she is feeding, whether she keeps returning to a specific spot. You now know what those behaviors mean and what the timeline behind them looks like. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched a bird, a goose, or anything else behave in a way that stayed with you, that felt like something you couldn't name at the time? And does any of what you saw make more sense now? If this reframes something for someone, send it to them. I read every comment. I'll see you in the next one.